Chris Hensley is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer member of FINRA SIPC, investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Houston First Financial Group are not affiliated.
The Houston Midtown chapter of the Society for Financial Awareness presents Money Matters with your host, Christopher Hensley.
Good morning, everybody. You're listening to Money Matters on KPFT Houston. It's 10 a.m. Got a great show lined up for you today. When it comes to health and diet, and we talk about sugar, there are better times of the year that we could be talking to you about this topic. When I got this together, I was sitting down with my son, and we were putting together a gingerbread house with icing and candy and sweets. But I am currently on a ketogenic diet, and one of the things that we're avoiding besides carbs is sugar. And that coincides with the newest book by author Gary Taubes, The Case Against Sugar. This book is going to be released next year, early next year, and I've already signed up on Audible for the pre-release of it. As part of my research for this show, he has also written a book called Good Calories, Bad Calories, and that is a 26-hour audio book that I am about 24 hours into. Very, very excited to have Gary on the show today. He is a writer for American Science, or Science Magazine, and very, very interesting topic. We're going to do a deep dive into the case against sugar. So please keep listening. Stay tuned. If you are a longtime listener, you know we always use the first few minutes of the show to tell you just a little bit about who we are and what we do. The Houston Midtown chapter of the Society for Financial Awareness, we are a nonprofit 501c3 educational speakers bureau. Our mission is to fight financial illiteracy. We do that by going out to different companies, different organizations, different groups, anywhere we can go in front of somebody's constituents, in front of somebody's employees, in front of somebody's members, if it's a professional society, who are looking to have financial literacy topics, retirement topics, debt topics, college funding topics. This time of the year, when it comes to finances, we are here in December. This is a critical point when it comes to your finances. People are out and about shopping right now. They're trying to keep up with the Joneses, trying to get the next biggest doodad, the next biggest gift, trying to outdo their neighbors. And what happens in January, after the credit card hangover is done, you're left with a big bill. So one of the top topics before the end of December, I believe it's going to be the last show of the month, we're going to have an end-of-the-year wrap-up, which is going to be directly related to your spending, your credit cards, your debt, and how to get off of the credit card Christmas time hangover. With that, let's go. I want to have as much time with Gary as possible, so let's go ahead and get Gary on the line here. Thank you for joining the show. Usually I'll start by letting the listeners know just a little bit about you through your bio. So let me share that with them now. Gary Taubes is an American science writer. He is the author of Noble Dreams, Bad Science, The Short Life and Weird Times of Cold Fusion, and Good Calories, Bad Calories. I mentioned earlier that that's the one I downloaded to listen to. 26 hours. I'm 24 hours into it today, this morning. Taubes' books have all dealt with scientific controversies. And so the newest book, A Case Against Sugar, I think follows right in that line. Gary, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you for your interest, Chris.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I like to do when I share the bio is see if you might be able to tell us a little bit about yourself outside of the bio.
Okay, well, so I'm not a doctor. I'm not a PhD nutritionist. I have a hard science background, actually a physics background. And I got into science journalism and then investigative science reporting 30-odd years ago. And turns out, just like there's a lot of bad science out there, just like there's a lot of bad, doctors who can't practice medicine and plumbers who do a lousy job on your sinks, there are scientists who do a lousy job in research, and that's been my obsession since the 80s. And when these situations arise, you end up having controversies about what the truth is or what a fact is. And some of my friends in the physics community said if I was interested in bad science, I had to look at the stuff in public health because that's terrible. That's how they described it. And so for 20 years, I've been working in the public health area, and I think the way my physicist friends described it was accurate. And about late 90s, I got into nutrition, looking at some of these sort of fundamental beliefs that we have about what makes a healthy diet or not, starting with whether salt causes high blood pressure. And it turns out the evidence for that is as weak as could be. If it was a criminal case, I don't even think you could get an indictment. You certainly couldn't get a conviction. And that just took me from salt and high blood pressure to dietary fat and heart disease, and then the cause of obesity and why we have the big question, why we have these obesity and diabetes epidemics, not just in the U.S., but worldwide. And that's been my obsession ever since. I think you mentioned that I co-founded a not-for-profit to help fund research in this area and resolve some of these controversies, because one of the conclusions I've come to, again, based on literally thousands of interviews and 15 years working in this field, is that the administrators, the government administrators, aren't really interested in funding these problems or even admitting to the existence of these controversies. And so we had to turn to the nonprofit sector to try and get some, the beginnings of resolution.
Absolutely, and as I am reading through the other book, kind of my eyes are opening to some of this, where the money's followed, the studies and that sort of thing. It's very eye-opening. But let's start off with the newest book, the Case Against Sugar. Why did you write the Case Against Sugar?
Well, simple answer is somebody had to do it. Again, it's almost unbelievable the level of misconceptions we've had about this compound in our diets, this chemical. And even the nutritionists and the research community, and certainly the public health authorities and the administrators at places like the FDA and the USDA, when they've tried to figure out, come to recommendations about sugar, whether we should be eating it, there's such a massive confusion that I hubristically thought that somebody had to set it straight. It might as well be me. And, the argument that ends up being made, again, is, we have this idea that sugar represents empty calories. That's the problem with it. So we consume too much of it, and it doesn't bring any vitamins or minerals or fiber to our diets, and that's what's bad about it. And that's sort of 100-year-old thinking. I mean, literally dates to like 1910, 1920. And it's never been updated. It's bizarre. And entire disciplines of medicine have emerged and grown up and matured, and we just consider them sort of irrelevant to this question of what sugar does. And I thought somebody had to update all that and actually lay out what the case should be, based on the evidence circa 2017 rather than the evidence circa 1917.
Absolutely. I know from the other book that I'm listening to right now, the history and the even the current research and what the public is thinking when it comes to American Standard Diet or Standard American Diet, two different things altogether. So one of the things, as I was sitting down, it's Christmas time. We're doing this show around in December. I was sitting down with my son. We were putting together a gingerbread man. I'm on a keto diet now. I can't have any candy or sugar. So I'm thinking to my head, as we're getting into this topic, what is bad about sugar?
Well, so the general thesis here, okay, so, let me give you what the sort of conventional thinking is. So the conventional thinking is we get fat because we eat too much or we exercise too little, and it's the process of getting fat that causes type 2 diabetes, and so this is all sort of a calorie issue. This is where you get into this idea that it's empty calories, it's just excess energy. But sugar is different from other carbohydrates, okay? So, when you eat bread or pasta or potatoes, it gets broken down into this carbohydrate called glucose, which goes into your circulation and raises your blood sugar. We talk about blood sugar, that's glucose. And virtually every cell in your body will burn that glucose for fuel. When we talk about sugar, that's the white stuff that you put in your coffee or sprinkle on cereal, or high-fructose corn syrup is sort of another variety of the same compounds. That's got glucose and this molecule called fructose. The fructose is a carbohydrate. That's the sweetest carbohydrate. That's what makes sugar sweet. It's what makes fruits sweet. The fructose is metabolized in your liver. Okay, so when you drink a soda or a fruit juice, virtually all of the calories come from sugar or high-fructose corn syrup, and half of those calories are fructose, and when you drink it, they're digested quickly, and they're dumped on your liver, and your liver has to basically deal with it, and it didn't evolve to deal with that level of fructose appearing that quickly. So in the process of doing it, it turns a lot of the fructose into fat. And then there's a lot of evidence suggesting that the accumulation of fat in the liver causes nonalcoholic fatty liver disease clearly, which is an epidemic. This is a fat accumulation in your liver, and also associates with the condition, and I'm sounding technical here, for which I apologize, called insulin resistance, which is the fundamental defect in type 2 diabetes. So you've basically got this compound that's metabolized in the liver and is sort of directly implicated in fat accumulation in the liver and in this condition called insulin resistance, which means type 2 diabetes. And it turns out we've known this since the early 1960s, obese individuals tend to be insulin resistant as well. So it's at least associated with obesity, and it might be implicated in the cause of that as well. So you've got this whole sort of admittedly speculative chain of mechanisms that say if you add sugar to any population's diet, doesn't matter if they're Inuits eating the equivalent of a keto diet, whale meat and seal meat and caribou, or, the pastoral populations in Africa living off the cattle they're herding, or agriculturalists. You add sugar to their diet, you'll eventually get obesity and diabetes.
Well,
epidemics.
You mentioned quite a few things that piqued my ears here. You talked about insulin resistance. You talked about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That's something that I was diagnosed with recently, and that's one of the reasons I'm doing the keto diet. But then also diabetes, and there's a good portion of Americans that have been diagnosed with diabetes. Let's back up for a moment, and because it's sounding like sugar is a bad thing. Can you tell us some of the history of how sugar got introduced into our diet?
Well, so we've been consuming sugar as a, species forever, but beginning around 2,500 years ago in India and China, the farmers start refining sugar. So you take sugar cane, which is, you could chew on the cane and it's sweet, but you then refine the sugar in it into this white powder. It's like, refining coca leaves into cocaine is actually a, realistic metaphor there. And then it spreads from India to the Middle East, spreads all around the Mediterranean, and then when with the discovery of America, the Caribbean becomes the heart of the sugar industry, and suddenly people go from, sugar as a luxury that's used more for medicinal purposes than anything else. It gets cheaper and cheaper, and it starts being used in every diet. One of my favorite quotes in the book is from, Germans and Italians who both said, in effect, no food isn't improved by the addition of sugar, and you can actually find recipes in 17th century England for sugar and oysters, which makes my blood curdle, but apparently they liked it. So anyway, sugar starts to get cheaper, it begins to saturate our diets. And then with the Industrial Revolution, the early 19th century, suddenly it gets very cheap to produce. The Europeans create a beet sugar industry, so you can now grow sugar in northern climates as well as in sort of equatorial climates. And second half of the 19th century, sugar consumption explodes, and you get the creation of the candy industry, the chocolate industry, the ice cream industry, and then the soft drink industry, all aimed at basically delivering sugar to children and women. Men had cigarettes and alcohol, and now the women were being then the children were getting, the sugar. And then about post-World War II, you see the explosion of the fruit juice industry, and then the sugary cereals, which are delayed by about 50 years because the cereal industry had come out of the health food movement. So the nutritionists in the cereal industry thought sugar was bad for them, for their consumers. But by 1948 or so, once one Post cereal started producing sugar crisps, everybody else got into the game in order to compete. So in the 1960s, you've sort of completed this process of completely saturating the American diet with sugar. And now every holiday, every celebration is, as you pointed out, gingerbread houses for Christmas, Valentine's Day is a candy holiday, birthdays are birthday cakes. Coke is the great American sort of symbol. There's a great line. Coca-Cola has a meeting in the post-World War II years where they decide they're planning their international strategy, and they have posters up saying that when we think of Russia, of communism, we think of, the Berlin Wall. When they think of America, they think of Coca-Cola.
Wow.
So it just it saturates our lives, and one of the questions I ask in the book, is this a drug or is this a food? Because you could imagine, you get to the point where no celebration in our lives is complete without, the pause that refreshes or a cupcake or a cake. We can't even take our kids to soccer games without rewarding them at the end of the game with treats anymore, sugar treats. And then with it, you see diabetes in particular going from it's an awful disease with or without pharmaceutical treatments. But prior to the discovery of insulin in the early 1920s, it was fatal, and, kidney failure, gangrene, amputation, blindness. And you look in the hospital records in the mid-19th century, which I did, and you can barely find the disease. Today, 1 in 11 Americans is diabetic. Go back to 1850, and the major hospitals in cities like Boston and Philadelphia, and maybe they had 1 or 2 cases of diabetes a year.
Wow.
And you find the same pattern, every population in the world where you could find the medical records, you can go back, 50 years, 100 years, and find a period when diabetes, if it existed, was exceedingly rare.
One of the things on our show that we like to talk about when we talk about finances is the correlation between financial stress and physical stress and then just health care. Can you talk a little bit about the financial implications of obesity and diabetes on the U.S. healthcare costs?
Well, the estimate today is that the direct medical costs of obesity and diabetes are about $1 billion a day. That's the burden on our health system. Then if you take in indirect costs, the problem is obesity and diabetes increased risk of heart disease and cancer and Alzheimer's and a host of other diseases. You could easily get into the $1 trillion range per year, depending on how you want to estimate it. And again, this is a worldwide phenomena. One of the, to me, most amazing aspects. Back in October, the National Academy of Medicine in Washington had its annual meeting, and the meeting was about, the title was Reversing the Dramatic 30-Year Rises in Obesity and Diabetes. And the keynote speaker was the Director General of the World Health Organization, a physician named Margaret Chan. And she said at this meeting that there was effectively zero chance that the public health authorities would reverse, so she called the obesity and diabetes epidemics a slow-motion disaster. That's a direct quote. And then she said there was effectively zero chance that the public health authorities like herself would not only would curb this epidemic, would reverse it, but zero chance that they would even curb it or bring it under control in the foreseeable future.
Wow, the slow motion disaster. That I like as a title. That gets your attention.
That gets your attention, and the fact that the leading public health authority in the world was admitting not only that they had failed so far, unprecedented public health failure, but was predicting with 100% certainty continued failure in the future.
Wow. I know, as on a personal level, as I have started limiting sugar, this is not an easy thing to do. You talked earlier about high-fructose corn syrup, but there are so many. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And I guess what I'm getting into is that there's many different names for the same thing.
Yeah, there's something 50-odd different names for sugar. You see it, when companies put the ingredients on package labels, they have to list the ingredients in order of their prominence, in their food. So the most common ingredient has to come first, and so if you look at sodas, it'll be water and then high-fructose corn syrup. But in order to get around that, you can use different kinds of sugars. So you can use, organic grape sugar and high-fructose corn syrup and sucrose and, dextrose. And the more you use, the fewer the smaller the concentration of each. So now you can break it down, and the second ingredient in the label in the ingredients doesn't necessarily have to be some form of sugar. But roughly 3 in every 4 products in the supermarket have added sugar of some form or another. Again, high-fructose corn syrup, which began to saturate our food supply also beginning in the late 70s, is just a different kind of chemical twist on the same chemical components as sugar itself. So it's almost impossible to avoid unless you're shopping on the outside aisles of the market. So the fruits and vegetables, and then the meats and eggs and milk products, dairy products, and of course the meat, eggs, dairy products have always been implicated by equally bad science in heart disease risk and cancer, and so that gets into an entirely another issue, but it's related and probably another show.
Absolutely. The other question I had for you is about metabolic syndrome, and where does it fall in the discussion of sugar? So
metabolic syndrome is a cluster of metabolic abnormalities. So all these, if you have, it's high triglycerides. So we've, again, beginning in the 1970s, 60s, we've been focused on cholesterol. The heart disease people, your doctor, all they think about is cholesterol. LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, HDL, the good. And one of the things I pointed out in Good Calories, Bad Calories book you're reading is that since the 1970s, researchers, the problem is public health authorities and doctors lock into the state of science at one point, and the science progresses. And they never shift, they never change. So since the 70s, we realized that the primary risk factor for heart disease is not actually LDL cholesterol. It's this cluster of abnormalities called metabolic syndrome. And that's if your HDL cholesterol is low, that's your good cholesterol, and your triglycerides are high, and your waist circumference is getting bigger, you're getting fatter, and you might have a condition called glucose intolerance, and the doctors have to define this by having 3 of 5 of these abnormalities. That's how they'll diagnose it. The primary one is just getting fatter. So if your waist you keep pushing your belt loops out, you probably have metabolic syndrome. And, since the 1960s, it's been clear that you can cause metabolic syndrome in animals, and at least some people, by feeding them sugar-rich diets. So again, it's sort of, if metabolic syndrome is caused by sugar, and there's a lot of evidence that it is, it's not definitive. That's why I call the book The Case Against Sugar instead of Evil Sugar or something like that. I mean, this is the case. Sugar causes this condition called metabolic syndrome. Then it's the cause of most obesity, diabetes, heart disease, all these chronic diseases that cluster together. The CDC today says 75 million Americans have metabolic syndrome, and that includes the obese Americans and many of the overweight Americans and pretty much the 30 million who have diabetes. And there's this chain of mechanisms that directly point to sugar consumption, including the nonalcoholic fatty liver that you've experienced. So, I mean, the way I describe it, I tend to think in terms of criminal metaphor. So if I was a defense attorney, a prosecutor, I could get an indictment on sugar causing all these diseases effortlessly. I'm not sure I could get a conviction because the evidence isn't definitive, but there's strong circumstantial evidence. We got the mechanism, we got the gun. Might get an acquittal, just like O.J. Simpson got an acquittal, but just like O.J. Simpson got an acquittal, if I was dating one of his ex-wives, I wouldn't want him living in the neighborhood. And I think there's enough evidence to avoid eating sugar if you don't want to pay that bill later on in your life.
Absolutely. At a minimum, it's going to make you look in that direction and say, am I doing the right things with my diet here? One last question as we're bumping towards the end of the show here. I have been trying to cut sugar, but what advice do you have for parents who are trying to get their kids off of the sugar train?
I mean, the easiest thing, you can't get them off because the neighbors, if they're friends, parents, they're always going to get it in their life. But if you keep it out of the house, and sugar's really an out-of-sight, out-of-mind phenomenon. If it's not in the house, if you don't have fruit juices and sodas available in the refrigerator, if you don't have, sugary snacks available, they'll forget. If they don't see it, they won't crave it. And so that, I think, is the easiest thing to do, is get it out of the house, and that'll cut their sugar consumption immediately. And then they'll go to parties, and again, there'll be the snacks after the soccer games, and it's hard to avoid that. But once you get it out of the house, you'll be solving much of the problem. And then educate them. I'm a firm believer. My mother-in-law disagrees, but I think you could. Our job as parents is to educate kids, not just on all the other things in life, but on good nutrition as well. So as long as they know that they're, racking up a health bill. I'm using, having listened to your introduction, that they can pay it now, but it might come due later. I think the kids will get it, that this is not something they should be sneaking.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Money Matters Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, visit us on the web at www.moneymatterspodcast.com. Drop us a line on SpeakPipe on the right-hand corner. It will receive any voicemails, questions, thoughts, concerns that you have about the show. In addition to this, we recently launched a Patreon campaign. Click on the Donate Now tab to hit the tip jar and find out what Patreon's campaign is all about.